Okay. This has got to be one of my favorite talks for obvious reasons. You'll see what I mean. Let's get started, shall we? Today, we're diving deep into a question that, well, it sparks the imagination like few others: the potential reality of Bigfoot.
hmm And we're not just dealing with campfire stories here. We've got some really interesting source material.
Exactly. It's a conversation with Dr. Jeff Meldrums. He's a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, author of Sasquatch Legend Meets Science. This comes from the Backcountry Manifesto podcast.
And what's key here, I think, is Meldrum's background. He's a proper anthropologist looking at this through a scientific lens. That's pretty unique for this topic.
It really is. So our goal with this deep dive is basically to walk through the evidence as Dr. Meldrum presents it and, get you up to speed on where things stand with this whole fascinating subject.
Sounds good. Where do we start?
All right, so Dr. Meldrum kicks things off with something fundamental, the names we use: Bigfoot, Sasquatch, even this other term, relict hominoid. What's the deal with all these different labels?
Yeah, that's important. Bigfoot really exploded into popular culture back in the 1950s. Meldrum talks about how a newspaper editor supposedly came up with it after that famous footprint cast discovery.
In Bluff Creek, California, right, at the construction site.
That's the one. And that name, Bigfoot, just stuck. It conjures up that image of a huge footprint, very visual.
It does, but Meldrum actually prefers Sasquatch, doesn't he? There's a specific reason for that.
Absolutely. Sasquatch has deeper roots. It comes from First Nations traditions up in Canada. A writer named J.W. Burns, he'll bring it into wider use, basically translates from several indigenous languages as something like wild person of the woods.
Which feels, I don't know, more descriptive, less cartoonish than Bigfoot, maybe.
Exactly. It's based on generations of observation and cultural context. And Meldrum points out this idea isn't just North American. He brings up the Chinese Yeren, the wild man.
Right, and the descriptions sound incredibly similar, even down to the footprints apparently looking almost identical. It does make you wonder if this is like a global thing.
It does raise that question. And then there's the scientific term Meldrum uses, relict hominoid.
Okay, break that down.
So relict in biology refers to a species that used to be widespread, but is now found only in a few isolated areas, like a living fossil almost.
Like that fish, the coelacanth.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
And hominoid refers to the group, including apes and humans. So a relict hominoid is suggesting a surviving population of an ancient human-like or ape-like creature. A Russian anthropologist, Boris Porshnev, coined it.
Got it. So Bigfoot is kind of the bumper sticker version. Sasquatch is maybe for more informed chat. And relict hominoid is the science speak.
That's a pretty good way to put it, yeah. It helps clarify what we're actually discussing.
Okay, let's circle back to Bluff Creek then. Meldrum calls that footprint find a real inciting event. Why was that specific discovery so huge for the Bigfoot story in North America?
Well, it's the visibility. That photo of the guy holding the massive plaster cast, it went everywhere. Newspapers picked it up across the country.
So it gave people something tangible to focus on instead of just stories.
Yeah. Exactly. Before that, you had older newspaper reports mentioning wild man sightings, sometimes even calling them gorillas. But this was different. This was a print.
But people weren't just accepting it wholesale, were they? There must have been skepticism from the start.
Oh, absolutely. The explanations were all over the map. Some thought maybe giant Native Americans. Others suggested an escaped patient from a mental institution, or even a weird bear.
A bear? How would that work?
Like maybe a bear with mutated or injured feet that left strange tracks. And of course, later on, some people claim they faked the prints. Meldrum finds those confessions pretty unconvincing when you look closely, but yeah, people were trying hard to explain it away.
It shows how hard it is to process something that doesn't fit, right?
Definitely. And Meldrum touches on some of those older accounts too, before Bluff Creek. The William Rowe story really stands out.
He was a prospector in BC. What makes his account so interesting?
It's just very. Matter of fact, from the 1950s, he saw this figure initially from behind. Very broad shoulders, hairy. Then it turned around.
In the description.
Very ape-like, he said. He specifically noted how it used its muscular lips to pull leaves or berries off branches, not its fingers like a human would.
Wow. And physically.
Bipedal, walked upright, had human-looking feet, and he mentioned seeing breasts, suggesting it was female, but it also had this heavy brow ridge, sloping forehead, A very primitive look overall.
So that mix, again, part human, part ape.
Exactly, that recurring theme. It's what makes the whole subject so compelling and also, so controversial.
Which leads us right into the Patterson-Gimlin film, 1967. For a lot of people, myself included probably, that's the image that comes to mind. Sounds like it was a huge moment.
Oh, definitely. A Bob Dylan moment, Meldrum calls it. Filmed late 67, and by early 69 it was being shown publicly. It had already been looked at by scientists at UBC, even the Smithsonian initially.
And you actually saw it as a kid in Spokane. That's amazing.
Yeah, I was about 10. They showed it at the Spokane Coliseum. Seeing that creature stride across the screen, it definitely leaves an impression.
I bet. And the film is still being analyzed today, isn't it, with new tech?
It is. Meldrum mentions things like composite stacking, layering multiple copies of the film, and stabilization software. It lets researchers see details much more clearly than was possible back then.
But it's not just about seeing the film better. Meldrum points out that our whole understanding of human evolution has shifted dramatically since 67.
That's a crucial point. Back then, the dominant idea was this sort of linear march of progress, one hominin species replacing another.
The single file idea.
Right. And the thinking in anthropology, influenced by ecology, was kind of like one niche, one species. The idea of another bipedal, human-like creature existing alongside us seemed, well, unlikely to many scientists.
But now we know it was much messier. More like a bush, with different hominin species living at the same time.
Exactly. And Meldrum connects this directly to the concept of relict hominoids globally. Not just Sasquatch in North America, but maybe the Yetis in the Himalayas, Homo floresiensis, the Hobbit in Indonesia, possibly even Neanderthals surviving longer in remote parts of Russia, or Australopithecines in Africa.
So, seeing Sasquatch as just one potential surviving branch on that bushy family tree makes it seem, well, maybe less impossible.
It provides a much broader evolutionary context, yeah. It reframes the question.
So, the PG film is obviously huge. But you said Meldrum was initially a bit hesitant to focus only on the film. What made him really dig into it?
Well, he didn't want the entire case for Sasquatch to hinge on one piece of footage. Films can be faked, debated forever. What really pulled him in, given his background, was the footprint evidence associated with the film site.
Ah, okay. Not just the film itself.
Right. Specifically, the 10 plaster casts made by a guy named Bob Titmus right after Patterson and Gimlin left.
10 casts. I didn't realize there were that many.
Yeah, and for Meldrum, who studies hominin locomotion, how early humans walked footprints are his bread and butter. Comparing these tracks to fossil prints, to modern ape prints, to human prints, that's his expertise.
So Patterson made casts too, right? A right and a left foot.
He did. And they captured the basic form, even on that rough, rocky ground. But some skeptics looked at them and said, they look too flat, too perfect. The sort of carved wooden foot theory came up.
Because they didn't show a clear arch like a human foot?
Kind of. But Titmus's 10 casts, even though some were partials, apparently captured more dynamic features, signs of how a real flexible foot interacts with the ground as it walks, not just a static block.
Which brings us to this anatomical detail Meldrum emphasizes, the mid-tarsal break. What exactly is that?
Okay, so it's not a fracture, not a break like a broken bone. It's an area of flexibility, an axis of movement in the middle of the foot.
Unlike our feet, which have that relatively rigid arch.
Exactly. The human foot has evolved for efficient long-distance running and walking, with that arch acting like a spring. This mid-tarsal break suggests a different kind of foot mechanics, maybe better suited for uneven terrain, something retained from a more primitive ancestor, different from modern apes, too.
So it could leave a different kind of print depending on how the foot flexes.
Precisely. Sometimes maybe a flatter print, like Patterson's casts, but other times, especially in softer ground maybe, it could create a pressure ridge right across the middle of the print.
And Meldrum found this in the Titmus casts.
He did. He says 8 out of the 10 Titmus casts showed evidence of this midfoot pressure ridge.
Wow. And then he connects it back even further, doesn't he, to the original Bluff Creek cast?
Yeah, he got to examine that original 1958 Jerry Crew cast, the one that spawned the name Bigfoot, and apparently it also shows that same kind of pressure ridge.
That's pretty compelling, linking the 58 print to the 67 film site prints through this specific feature.
And it gets better. He mentions footprint casts from China, attributed to the Yeren, the Chinese wild man. They also show a remarkably similar pressure ridge.
Okay, that's significant. The same unusual feature popping up in tracks from California and China suggests it's not just random.
It points towards a consistent biological trait, potentially linking these reported creatures across continents.
Which leads him to talk about ichnotaxonomy. That sounds complicated.
It's basically the science of classifying creatures based on their traces, like footprints, especially when you don't have the actual body, an echnotaxon.
So like finding dinosaur footprints, even without the dinosaur bones, the prints tell you something existed.
Exactly. Find a unique six-toed dinosaur track. You can name a new ichnospecies based on that track, even if you never find the six-toed dinosaur skeleton.
So applying that here, the argument is that this consistent, unique footprint morphology, particularly that mid-tarsal pressure ridge found in multiple locations, represents a real biological entity, an OT taxon operational taxonomic unit, even without a type specimen.
That's the idea. It elevates the footprints beyond just anecdotal evidence to something that can be potentially classified scientifically.
Okay, but let's face it, the elephant in the room, or maybe the Sasquatch in the woods, is always, where's the body? Meldrum acknowledges this is the big sticking point for skeptics, right?
Oh, absolutely. He knows it's a reasonable question. He tells a story about presenting at the University of Wyoming, and the department chair, a forensic archaeologist, asked him point blank, where are the bodies? Even big-name skeptics like Michael Shermer hammer on this.
So how does he respond? You can't just magic up a body.
Well, part of his response is about the nature of science. You often start with evidence, with questions, not necessarily with the final answer or the complete specimen.
Science begins with a question, not a body.
Right. And then there's what he calls the apologist response, trying to explain the lack of remains using natural history. Things like, well, what's their likely population density? Probably very low.
We'll get to those numbers later, I think.
Yeah. And what happens when they die in the forest? The Pacific Northwest, for example, has very acidic soil. Bones don't last long unless they're fossilized under specific conditions. Plus, scavenging, decomposition. Finding any large mammal skeleton in that environment is rare.
So it's not like finding fossils in dry caves or tar pits.
Not at all. He mentioned talking this over with that Wyoming department chair later, pointing out that focusing only on the missing body means potentially ignoring the pattern of evidence that does exist, the footprints, the film. He feels his expertise is in analyzing those footprints, and that evidence deserves consideration.
He makes a distinction that I think is really important between healthy skepticism and what he calls ideological skepticism.
Yeah, that's key. Healthy skepticism is crucial for science, right? You need to question things, demand evidence. But ideological skepticism is more like deciding beforehand that something can't be real, and then refusing to seriously engage with any evidence presented.
Like the anecdote about Michael Shermer, the editor of Skeptical Inquirer, apparently not even knowing about Meldrum's book despite being a prominent Bigfoot skeptic.
Exactly. It suggests a dismissal without actually looking at the research. Meldrum also talks about the frustration of seeing his book, which is presented as scientific analysis, getting shelved in bookstores under New Age or paranormal.
Not exactly where you'd put a book on primate anatomy and biomechanics.
Right. He wants it evaluated on its scientific merits.
Uh-huh.
He even mentions an issue with a Bigfoot exhibit at his own university's Museum of Natural History, where he, the resident expert, was initially left out of the planning, and the framing was heavily tilted towards skepticism.
That seems pointed. Okay, let's go back to the PG film critiques. One you hear is about the hairy breasts. The argument being, no ape has hairy breasts. How does Meldrum tackle that?
He uses a simple analogy, goosebumps. When we get goosebumps, those little bumps are muscles attached to hair follicles. So if you have skin that gets goosebumps, you have hair follicles there, even if the hair is very fine.
So the idea of primates having totally bare chests is just wrong.
Pretty much. Chimps have hair all over. So seeing hair on the chest or breast area of the figure in the film isn't actually anatomically impossible or even unusual for a primate.
Okay, what about the hybrid anatomy claim? You know, ape top, human bottom, supposedly an evolutionary impossibility.
Meldrum points straight to the fossil record, specifically Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis. When Lucy was discovered, scientists described her in similar terms, a mosaic of ape-like upper body features and a more human-like lower body adapted for walking upright.
So, far from being impossible, that kind of combination is actually part of our known evolutionary history.
Precisely. It counters that specific critique quite effectively.
And the gait. Some argue it walks too much like a human, especially given the apparent physique.
Right. Meldrum explains the difference between typical human male and female gaits. Human females tend to have a slightly wider gait because of a wider pelvis, an adaptation for childbirth. specifically for large-brained babies.
Okay.
Apes, and presumably Sasquatch if it exists, have relatively smaller brains compared to their body size, so their females likely wouldn't need that extra pelvic width. Their gait would naturally be closer to that of a human male, which is pretty much what you see in the film, a powerful, compliant gait, but without that pronounced hip sway sometimes seen in human females.
Makes sense. What happened to the guys who shot the film, Patterson and Gimlin? Did their story ever waver?
Roger Patterson died of cancer, leukemia, some years after the film. But Meldrum says he stuck to his story right to the end. His wife confirmed that too. Bob Gimlin is still alive.
Yeah.
Meldrum mentioned going to his birthday party recently in Yakima.
And Gimlin, has he ever changed his account after all these decades?
Nope. Rock solid. Meldrum tells a story about some filmmaker offering Gimlin a lot of money for an exclusive confession that it was all a hoax.
Yeah.
Gimlin told him absolutely not what they filmed was real. Apparently, he and his wife went through a lot of harassment and ridicule after the film came out. It wasn't easy. But he's maintained the same story consistently for over 50 years. In recent years, he's actually started participating in some events, sharing his story, like at the Washington State Historical Society.
That consistency is certainly notable. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. How do researchers like Meldrum even begin to figure out where to look? How do you define potential Bigfoot habitat?
It's interesting. He mentioned an editorial in a scientific journal, the Journal of Biogeography, where some researchers actually used Bigfoot sighting data just as a data set to test ecological niche modeling software.
Seriously, what did they find?
The model predicting potential Bigfoot distribution ended up looking almost identical to the known habitat distribution for black bears.
So the tongue-in-cheek conclusion was Bigfoot equals black bear?
Sort of, yeah. But the underlying point was that the ecological niche for a large omnivorous creature in those environments is very similar. Which makes sense.
But Meldrum stresses they aren't the same biologically, right? Bear versus potential hominoid.
Big difference, he argues. Bears come from a carnivorous lineage. They're basically, as he puts it, canned carnivores, adapted to eat plants too. A hypothetical Sasquatch, he thinks, likely descends from a more herbivorous primate ancestor, maybe like Gigantopithecus.
So different teeth, different digestive systems.
Probably. Sasquatch might have a much larger colon for fermenting tough plant material, maybe even practice coprophagy, eating feces like some herbivores do to get more nutrients. Very different biology.
Okay. And based on that and things like social structure, he estimates a population density.
Yeah, and it's low. His rough estimate is maybe one Sasquatch for every 200 black bears in the same suitable habitat.
1 per 200 bears, that's sparse.
Very. Using Idaho as an example with maybe 35,000 black bears, that would translate to only around 175 Sasquatch in the entire state. He bases this on assuming a solitary nature, like orangutans, a large home range, maybe 1,000 square miles, forest productivity. All factors leading to a very low density.
Which would certainly help explain why solid proof is so hard to come by. You're not exactly tripping over them.
Exactly. It makes encounters inherently rare events.
So when researchers do actively look, what's the process? What are they finding?
It involves a lot of prep work, studying maps, Google Earth, identifying potential food sources, seasonal changes, likely travel corridors, trying to predict where one might be.
Is it mostly nighttime searching?
Interestingly, no. Meldrum mentions analysis by researcher John Green, suggesting sightings are actually reported just as often in daylight as at night. Meldrum himself isn't keen on field work disrupting his sleep anyway.
Fair enough. But even actively looking, finding proof is like finding a needle in a haystack, right?
He uses a lottery ticket analogy. Buying more tickets increases your chance, but the odds on any single ticket are tiny. It's not guaranteed. They do deploy things like game cameras, motion-triggered, infrared.
Have those captured anything definitive? The money shot?
Not yet, apparently. Getting permission to place them can be tricky, and often they're used more in reaction to finding other evidence, like tracks. No clear photos or videos from those efforts that he mentioned.
What about other physical evidence like hair?
Hair samples have been collected, snagged on branches, found near sightings, and Meldrum says there's a surprising consistency. They often lack a cellular medulla, which is rare in humans. They span a range of colors but show similar microscopic features even when found far apart.
But DNA is the key, isn't it? What about DNA from these hairs?
That's the tricky part. Without that cellular medulla, getting good quality uncontaminated DNA is really difficult. Sometimes analysis comes back as human.
Which could be contamination?
Could be contamination, yeah.
Right.
Or if Sasquatch are very closely related hominins. Current sequencing might not be fine-grained enough to easily distinguish degraded samples from human DNA. He actually suggests looking for chromosomal differences, like inversions, places where chromosomes are rearranged compared to humans and chimps, might be a more fruitful approach than standard sequencing.
Interesting. Okay, let's talk origins. One popular idea connects Sasquatch to Gigantopithecus. Who was this creature?
Gigantopithecus was a huge ape, known from fossils, mostly jaws and teeth found in eastern Asia. It lived during the Pleistocene, the Ice Age epoch, and only went extinct relatively recently, maybe a few 100,000 years ago.
And it was massive, right? Grover Krantz did that famous reconstruction based on the jaw fragments?
Yeah, showing this incredibly robust ape with huge jaws, powerful chewing muscles indicated by features like a sagittal crest on the skull. The appeal of the theory is obvious. You got a giant ape in the right general part of the world, Asia, at roughly the right time to potentially cross the Bering Land Bridge into North America when sea levels were lower.
Size, place, time it seems to fit, but what's the big missing piece?
Bipedalism. All we have are jaws and teeth. There's no skeletal evidence, no pelvis, no leg bones to tell us if Gigantopithecus walked upright like the creature in the Patterson-Gimlin film or described in sightings.
So finding a Gigantopithecus femur, a thigh bone, showing adaptations for walking upright, that would be huge.
That would be the game changer for that specific hypothesis, yeah.
Mhm.
A femur with a valgus angle, the inward slant from hip to knee, or a knee joint built for upright posture. That's the smoking gun needed to link Gigantopithecus directly to Sasquatch descriptions.
And the timeline for Sasquatch in North America, if they are real, could be quite ancient.
Potentially hundreds of thousands of years, Meldrum speculates, depending on when land bridge crossings were possible.
So looking ahead, say, the next 50 years, what does Meldrum think? Will we get definitive proof?
He's hopeful. He thinks it's quite possible. He imagines scenarios like a hunter stumbling across remains, maybe a truck driver hitting one, or a caver finding bones deep in a cave system.
But fossilization is tricky, as we discussed.
Right. He notes that Gigantopithecus fossils in Asia were often found in caves, possibly dragged there by porcupines gnawing on bones. But in the typical forest habitats associated with Sasquatch, with acidic soils and decomposition, preservation is much less likely. Still, he hopes to see conclusive proof within his lifetime.
And if proof does emerge, if suddenly tomorrow there's undeniable evidence, what's his message to the lifelong skeptics?
He says, with a bit of humor, that he'd try to be magnanimous, but maybe offer certain individuals an extra serving of crow.
Haha, I can imagine.
He acknowledges there would probably be a huge bandwagon effect, with everyone suddenly accepting it. But he also emphasizes the decades of work already done by serious researchers who took the evidence seriously from the start.
This has been absolutely fascinating. Really appreciate you walking us through Dr. Meldrum's perspective. If people listening want to learn more, where should they go?
Well, Dr. Meldrum definitely recommends his book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science. He describes it as a good primer, lots of illustrations, over 150 apparently, available online, bookstores.
Okay, good starting point.
And for more in-depth ongoing research, he points to the online journal he edits called the Relict Hominoid Inquiry. It's peer-reviewed, open access, so free to read, and has research papers, historical documents, reviews, commentary, really dives into the details.
How do people find that?
Just search the name, the Relict Hominoid Inquiry, or the website is issue.edurhe. That's Idaho State University's site.
Perfect. Great resources. Look at this. I can't believe how heavy this thing is. Implied reference to the book.
It's comprehensive.
Well, that about wraps up another deep dive. Seriously fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And a huge thank you to all of you for listening. If you found this conversation interesting, please do us a favor, like, comment, maybe share it with a friend, and definitely subscribe so you don't miss future deep dives. Your support really helps us keep doing this. Again, thank you very much for tuning in. Now go check out one of these other discussions. I like this one over here. This one was a good one too, I promise.